Welcome back to Gospel at a Glance. I'm Andy, and I'm so glad you're here. It is good to be back on the podcast this week. We had some technical issues with a microphone last week, so that is why we were unable to kind of do the podcast as usual. So, let's jump back in. We stopped last week with the parable of the weeds, where Jesus addressed the persistence of evil and the patience of judgment. And he immediately tells two very short parables. Brief, understated, a mustard seed, a measure of yeast, but together they answer another pressing question. If the kingdom of heaven is real, why does it look so small? In a world that expects visible power and immediate transformation, Jesus describes something quieter. So let's check out the scripture for today. All right, today's scripture is Matthew 13, 31 through 33, and this is the parable of the mustard seed and the parable of the yeast. He put before them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed that someone took and sowed in his field. It is the smallest of all the seeds, but when it has grown, it is the greatest of shrubs and becomes a tree, so that the birds of the air come and make nests in its branches. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like yeast that a woman took and mixed in with 3 measures of flour until all of it was leavened. And that is our scripture for today. So let's jump into some reflections. First with the mustard seed. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, the smallest of seeds planted in a garden. In first century Palestine, mustard seeds were super tiny, proverbially tiny. They represented insignificance or something that is barely noticeable. Yet, when they're planted, that mustard plant could grow into a large shrub, like the parable says, large enough for birds to perch in its branches. The imagery here echoes the Old Testament language where large trees symbolized kingdoms that provided shelter for the nations. So the contrast is intentional. The kingdom does not begin with something big and spectacular. It begins with something that's easy to overlook. But that smallness is not weakness. That small seed carries life within it. Jesus emphasizes contrast. The smallest seed becomes the largest of the garden plants. And this is a theological perspective. This is a way of talking about God. What looks unimpressive at the beginning should not be mistaken for something that is irrelevant. At this point in Matthew's narrative, Jesus doesn't look like the arrival of the Messiah the way people thought the Messiah would arrive. They expected a hero, a warrior, someone who could smite Rome and free the Jews. But he doesn't have an army, he doesn't have a palace, and he doesn't have political, institutional power like Rome. And yet he speaks of expansion, of growth of the kingdom that exceeds expectation. The kingdom's beginning doesn't predict its final scope. So that beginning, that small seed, is going to grow into something much bigger. The second parable shifts the imagery. The kingdom is like yeast that a woman mixes into a large amount of flour until it works through all the dough. Unlike the mustard seed, which grows visibly upward and outward, yeast works invisibly. It disappears into the dough, but its effects transform the entire batch of bread. This is the quiet power of influence. The kingdom doesn't always announce itself loudly, but it permeates and it changes people and institutions from within. So notice how ordinary these images are. A garden seed, bread preparation. Jesus is describing the kingdom not in terms of some sort of conquest or conquering, but cultivation, right? He's not talking about domination. He's talking about things that transform. And in a world expecting immediate revolution, expecting a warrior Messiah, that would have sounded like a letdown. That would have sounded underwhelming. But Jesus reframes the expectation here. The kingdom's power is not in spectacle, but the kingdom's power is in persistence. Placed after the parable of the weeds, these two parables function as reassurance. Yes, evil exists. Evil persists. Yes, judgment waits. But rest assured that growth is happening. Growth of the kingdom is happening. Even when it looks small, even when it is working unseen, the kingdom of heaven advances in ways that don't always register in the most obvious ways. So what are the takeaways for today? The kingdom often begins in ways that seem insignificant. But smallness doesn't equal weakness. And growth can be slow, but still be very real. The kingdom transforms from within, and God's work may be visible, may be invisible before it is undeniable. And that's faith, right? We have faith that these things are at work. In closing, the mustard seed reminds us not to despise small beginnings. The yeast reminds us that unseen work still changes things. If the kingdom feels quiet in your life, or if growth seems slow, if faithfulness feels small, Jesus would say, keep watching, because what God plants grows, and what God mixes in transforms. Thank you so much for listening to Gospel at a Glance. It really was a wild and kind of exhausting week last week, despite the technical issues. There were other things going on just in life. And so I just want to take an extra moment to thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. This podcast is really a great learning experience for me and a happy place. And I just appreciate you being here and listening. Until next time, have a great day.